to 25 years. It is still shaped and driven by regulations and policies and legislative requirements that will affect the opportunities for many of the products that you're developing, many of the services that you're developing. So what I wanted to do today was to give you an overview of some of the main areas of policy. I'm going to talk through a few slides, but then really want to hear your questions and your comments. And as Mark said, I'm going to be previewing for you our legislative scorecard for 2015 that we'll be presenting at our annual legislative roundup tomorrow morning in downtown Boston.
Janet, can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Yes.
I just also wanted to give a shout out because we've got also participating from New York is we have NYC Acre. We've got representation there from Pat, who's new director of Acre. We've got Project over there. We've got Ecology Solar. So just wanted to make sure you guys know that you're not alone. You're also being communicated with from the New York office, and they'll have an opportunity to also chime in with questions.
Great, thanks, Kim. And so let me talk a little bit about NECEC, and that's a great segue. So what is NECEC? So NECEC is a clean energy business, innovation and policy organization, we say in the blurbs when we write comments to policymakers so that they think we're important and we're representing lots and lots of people and they'll listen to us. And what that means is it started about 8 or 9 years ago now by investors in clean energy companies who thought that they actually needed to have an association for these clean energy companies to join to provide them with the support they were going to need to succeed in the market. I am not a technical person, which will rapidly become obvious to you all. I think of a lot of what you do is people thinking of things and building them in their garage, and then they want to turn them into a real business and go out into the marketplace. And so the original founders of NECEC thought some of those folks needed help in making that transition, and then through things like Greentown, I think, through our innovation programs, we take that the next step. And then at some point, as you're going out into the market, you're going to interface with policymakers, regulators, and find out there are all sorts of rules that are affecting what you can do for a business. So we have something like 150 or so clean energy business members. They range in size from really large companies like Enernoc, Conservation Services Group, who's now Clear Result, Sun Edison, big developer of wind and solar projects around the world, to medium-sized companies like Digital Lumens, which just redid the lighting here, to smaller companies that are just getting started. Cato, I think, is one of our smaller companies that came through some of our innovation programs, and a host of others. What Policy and Government Affairs does for you all is that we try to represent you in the debate, in the legislative process, in the policy-making process that leads to what it is, what the environment is in which you have to operate. Kim insisted that I put this up here. This is just my background, which you can, really it's just my checkered past, but I can't hold a job. I started as a low-income advocate, then worked on low-income wood stove safety programs, then small hydro development, then went back to the Kennedy School because I realized I needed some quantitative skills to keep doing what I was doing. Went to the Mass Energy Office, as it was called at the time, worked at the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission, Mass Public Utilities Commission, was a commissioner there for 5 years as we restructured the electric industry. And I'll reference some of the stuff going on today, which I really feel is a bit like restructuring 2.0. Then realized, I then did some consulting so I could see my kids occasionally, I thought. Then went to National Grid because I'd never worked for a big utility before. And then came to the New England Clean Energy Council. So I feel like that was a bit coming back to my early roots as a small hydro developer in New England, and the company that I work for is one of our members, Essex Hydro Associates. So what goes around comes around. But what that means is I bring a lot of perspectives to this role, and I feel that for me it's very exciting to be at NECEC because I can share some of those perspectives and share those insights about how utilities work, how regulators think, how policymakers think. But I have some appreciation for the business side of things, both from a utility perspective, but also having worked with a small hydro company, and then for a year there I was the policy director for a national independent power producers organization. So bring all that background to bear, hopefully effectively on your behalf. So how do we figure out what we're paying attention to? So here's my little map of the clean energy policy context, and I always joke with the innovation guys because I'm also not that tech savvy, but I knew guys would love bubbles. It's very easy to sort of diagram this. So when I joined in 2012, there was like one thing going on, big Massachusetts energy legislation. That was our focus in 2012. 2013, it was Connecticut's comprehensive energy strategy. That was the big focus in 2013. 2014, the plan was going to be some big legislation in Rhode Island, really expanding their renewable energy growth program. And that's where our model fell apart, because by 2014, Connecticut expected us to come back to Connecticut, Mass expected us to be active in Massachusetts, and then we have partners in New Hampshire, Maine, and Vermont, and we started to dabble in New York because they decided to do reforming the energy vision, which is their version of grid modernization, or you might hear the phrase the 21st century electricity system. So in 2014, we were in lots of different places. And so for 2015 and now for 2016, we started to map out where our focus was going to be, because we couldn't be all things to all people. And through 2015, these are the three big bubbles here at the top, are areas that really rose to the top. There's a fourth one that I'm not talking about so much here because I don't think it's of interest to you, which is about contracting and financial support for large grids for wind, how you combine wind transmission and hydro. People are interested in that, I can talk about that later, but I left that bubble off for today. So the issues really fall into three buckets that I think are affecting a lot of emerging companies as well as all the established companies, and particularly the utilities that may be your customers for your services and products, as well as regular old people and businesses as your customers. So one is grid modernization. So I've said 21st century utility system. In New York, that's reforming the energy vision, or New York Rev, some of this little text on the side. In Massachusetts, the three utilities have just filed their GMPs, or grid modernization plans, in August. So that's what it's talking about in Massachusetts. In Rhode Island, it is System Integration Rhode Island, and they've borrowed the name SERI for that, where there's some ongoing discussions with Rhode Island's energy office about what's going to happen. And New Hampshire and Connecticut are also talking about this. Second area that's really affected by policy is what's happening with energy efficiency, saving kilowatt hours, which you might just think that's just stuff people go do, the utilities do that. But they do that within a framework of statutes and regulations in all of the Northeast states that have been set up over the years that either require the procurement, you'll hear this phrase, of all cost-effective energy efficiency. What does that mean? That means all energy efficiency that costs less than supply. What does that mean? Well, it all depends on what time frame you look. So as you know, as many of you may know, decision to invest in a new appliance that's more efficient or insulate your house, you have to put upfront capital, you get your savings back over time. What happens with efficiency programs is the utilities either use ratepayer money, or they leverage private money, or as they're called sometimes, the program administrators, whoever's running the energy efficiency program, and they help to buy down that payback for you, so that you decide it's worth spending $1,500 to insulate your garage, because somebody's going to pay for half of that, so it's only costing you $800, and that helps you save energy over time. Demand response has gotten a lot of attention. So energy efficiency is generally understood to be saving kilowatt hours, meaning using less electricity. Demand response is about using less electricity at a particular point in time, or reducing your peak demand on the system. And this has gotten really important in New England and the Northeast, and is getting a lot of attention because we've actually been tremendously successful in reducing the number of kilowatt hours we use. So you'll hear people say that our load growth is flat, or our energy use is flat. But as a consequence, we've gotten peakier. And what that means is that we use the difference between the peak usage and the average usage has gotten bigger. And if you think about it, on a day like the last couple of days that we've had, where it's been 90 degrees, a heat wave, that means people are running more air conditioning at peak times, businesses are running more air conditioning. That can lead to a new system peak. In order to meet the system peak, traditional generation is run, and it's dispatched in order of cheapest to most expensive. So electricity costs more at a peak time of day. And what that can mean for you is that if you have a technology or a service or a software product that can reduce a customer's peak usage, you can save them money, so they might pay you to do that, but you can also save the system money. So somebody in charge of keeping the system going might pay you to do that, such as the utility, through the capacity markets or the demand response programs run by the ISO New England, the integrated system operator, which runs all of New England, and then New York has its own ISO that runs all of New York. So demand response is getting more and more attention because, in fact, we have, in New England at least, about the dirtiest generators and have to run about 100 hours a year out of the 8,760 hours that there are in the year, which is some number that you learn when you work in the utility industry and you don't ever forget. So 100 hours out of 8,760 isn't much, but it's really expensive, like $1,000 a megawatt hour, as opposed to $100 a megawatt hour. So in fact, if you can do things that don't use those generators, plus they're the dirtiest, so then you don't have the emissions from those generators, and they may not be the most reliable, they may use fuels that you don't like, get rid of that by doing something like adjusting the air conditioning in your building or your facility down a few degrees, which cumulatively, with lots of other people doing that, saves lots of megawatts. That's a great thing. So all of that falls into this category here that I've labeled energy efficiency, demand response, emerging technologies, including things like storage, microgrids, other kinds of CHP, other ways of renewable thermal technologies, things that will just use less energy by making some change. Then the third topic, which I think if you're in at all the energy business in New England, and you have turned on the TV or read a newspaper or anything over the summer, you know that solar is a hot topic. How's that for my little pun? Distributed generation, net metering, which is, Massachusetts has had great incentives for solar, and rooftop solar is everywhere. You drive along and you see it on all sorts of houses. And what that means is that they have incentives, which are programs like Commonwealth Solar, and there's solar rebates, and there's $1 payment for every kilowatt hour of solar that you generate, or you can generate RECs, which are renewable energy credits. And because there's a law that says everybody has to have a certain percentage of renewables in their mix, called the RPS, or the Renewable Portfolio Standard, those RECs are worth money. That money goes back to any homeowner or any, say, third-party supplier who's leasing a solar to a customer as a way to help pay for the solar. And then we have net metering, which has gotten attention nationally, which is basically running your meter backward. So that if in fact you have some generation what's said behind the meter, meaning on your side of the meter and not the utility side of the meter, because you have solar on your roof, essentially your meter is not terribly sophisticated. And when they started this, they didn't want to go around giving everybody 2 meters. So it runs your meters backwards. So if you use 100 kilowatt hours a month and you generate, 80 kilowatt hours a month, your meter only registers 20 kilowatt hours a month, and that's all you pay for to your utility. If you actually use 100 kilowatt hours a month and you generate 150 kilowatt hours a month, the utility will credit you that extra 50 kilowatt hours, and you can buy down your customer charge and you can carry dollars over to the next month. That's the system that's been in place in Massachusetts. And we've seen something like close to over 800 megawatts of solar developed, hitting Governor Patrick's goal 4 years early. Governor Baker has reiterated the goal of actually then Governor Patrick increased his 400 megawatt goal to 1,600 megawatts. Governor Baker has reiterated the 1,600 megawatts and beyond. So not only do we want to get to 1,600 megawatts of solar in the Commonwealth, we want to do even more than that. But the debate over the last year has been, are the incentives too rich? And they are the most generous incentives in the country. I just have to break that to everybody. So as we have this policy debate about net metering and about solar incentives, and you hear this phrase, a sustainable long-term solar policy framework, or a long-term sustainable solar policy framework, you can rearrange the words. The idea is it's a policy framework that you're going to be able to continue because it's going to adjust to what's happening in the market, adjust to market conditions. So if solar gets cheaper, the incentive goes down. If something happens, pardon me, that makes solar more expensive, the incentive can adjust upwards. So this has been the topic of 2015, right? We're still in 2015. In Massachusetts, it's been, there was a net metering solar task force in the spring. Senator Downing, who is the chair of the Senate Committee on Energy, has put an amendment on a bill that passed that says, let's remove the net metering cap. Gosh, I forgot this critical thing. So in Massachusetts, you can net meter, but only up to so many megawatts. And we've hit that cap. So in fact, in the National Grid Service territory, we're hitting it in the other territories. And so one of the things that we have been urging at NECEC and many other solar advocacy groups is we need to raise the cap, we need to eliminate the cap because it's stifling the market, it's preventing projects from going forward. So that debate has been ongoing. There was a net metering task force. There's a bill from Senator Downing. The governor has now filed a bill. I think there's a fair amount of consensus that you need to lift the cap. It's not helpful to the market. The question is, or the debate has been around how do you get the incentive or the price for solar right before, do you need to do that before you lift the cap so you're not paying too much, or can you lift the cap while you figure out the right incentive or the right price? So that has gotten huge attention here in Massachusetts, but other states as well, Vermont, Rhode Island, all of the Northeast states, New York. It's just one of the topics out there. So those are the three broad areas of policy that, at least from my side, I see affecting many of your businesses most, but you should tell me if there's other areas of policy that matter a lot and you want to hear about as well. I already mentioned the large, long-term contract stuff. These three areas are actually coming together in a really arcane place, which is about rate design. So I've been accused of being a rate design junkie. People comment that my face lights up when I talk about rate design. And you're all sitting there thinking, what the hell is rate design? Rate design is how utilities decide to charge you for the electricity you use or the natural gas. And it's a thing that's, I'm sure there's a word for it in competitive marketing. It's how airlines price their seats. So it's not that, you actually experience this all the time. If you're willing to sit in the back and you buy your ticket way ahead of time, you can pay less than if you buy your ticket late in the game and you want to sit in the exit row or up in the front and you pay more for it. So the utility so an airline figuring out how much money it needs to pay for the airplanes and deciding how it can price all those seats, that's rate design from an airline's perspective. For the utility, rate design means how much do they charge you a month as a customer charge or a fixed charge that you pay just to be connected. Even if you go away for the summer or the winter and you're not using any electricity, you still pay that a month. Then how much do they charge you based on what's called a variable or volumetric charge, meaning how much electricity or kilowatt hours you use, versus how much they might charge you for a demand charge, meaning how many kilowatts or how much electricity do you demand at any one point in time. And you might say, why does this matter at all? I mean, my electric bill is always around $100. I pay it. Do I really care which component is affected by what? For those of you who are marketing solar technologies to customers in a context of net metering, you know why it matters. Because net metering is valuable to customers because a lot of the way you pay for electricity is on a volumetric or kilowatt hour basis. So if you can save those kilowatt hours because you're actually generating them yourself, then you can save a lot of money and your payback on your solar investment might be 7 years. But if the way the utility bills you for electricity is a big upfront charge or a charge that's based on your peak demand on the system, and if that doesn't match up with the peak output of your solar, and the way you're being compensated is by getting to run your meter backward for the kilowatt hours that you're not using, and those kilowatt hours, instead of being worth 18 cents, are now worth 10 cents, that makes a real difference in terms of the payback that you experience. So that's sort of an example with solar and net metering as to why rate design matters. Rate design matters for energy efficiency and demand response too, because the reason, again, you do energy efficiency is you don't use kilowatt hours, you save that money. If each of those kilowatt hours is cheaper than it used to be, you don't save as much money. Cheaper is good, but you also want to be thinking about incentives and how long you want to wait for your payback. Demand response is a great one. So if in fact more of your electricity is priced based on how much you demand at one time, then you'll be encouraged to reduce your demand at peak times. And that's good for you and it's good for the system. And so, as I said earlier, you might get paid by the utility, you also might get paid by the independent system operator, and you might just have to you don't have to pay a high charge, so you save something there yourself. And then a lot of emerging technologies like storage are really focused on letting you move your electricity use around. You can generate it at a cheap time, and then you store it, and then you use your own stored electricity at an expensive time. So your ability to sell your storage technology to customers really is very, very affected by how customers have to pay for electricity. Then grid modernization. So this is sort of the platform, you hear the analogy, for all the great apps that you guys are developing. And so for grid modernization, it's about better sensing and communications technologies on the utility side of the meter or the grid side, so that they actually know what's happening on their system on a hot summer day, and they know that distribution line X is overloaded, and they have to reduce usage or demand on that line, which they do by a rule of thumb, because it's 90 degrees outside, and I'm sure there are folks here who know the formulas from physics, I think it is, or electrical engineering. I have to learn a little bit of this working in the industry. But basically, the rule of thumb is if it's 80 degrees outside and there's this much load on the line, you can't put any more load on it. When in fact, that line may be perfectly fine, because otherwise it'll sag, raise safety concerns. But that line might be fine. So with grid modernization technologies, smarter technologies, they know which lines are sagging, which ones are not sagging, which can be more heavily loaded, how they can reroute the electricity, instead of going out and building bigger and bigger distribution circuits, or saying to people, gee, I'm sorry, you can't connect on this distribution circuit. On the customer side, which gets a lot of attention, it's smart grid, it's smart meters. It's a meter that gives the customer information about when you're using your electricity, when it costs more to use your electricity, when it costs less, tells the utility what you're doing, tells the utility if you're out. When your power's out, you need to call. You can't rely on your next door neighbor calling. You need to call, because you may not be on the same circuit as your next door neighbor, and the utility has no idea your power's out without some of the smart technologies that have not yet been deployed in Massachusetts. So there we have Massachusetts ordering the 3 companies, the DPU, the regulators, the policymakers saying to the utilities, come in with a grid modernization plan. How are you going to modernize the grid in the next 5 years to deploy smart meters everywhere? So those plans got filed in August. National Grids has a plan to deploy smart meters everywhere in the next 5 years that costs about $800 million. Then they have some other plans that cost less, that do less deployment of smart meter technology. Eversource has a plan that lets people volunteer to get smart meters. I'm greatly simplifying these plans, so if you're interested, I'm happy to have a deeper discussion. And that costs about $400 million, and they do a bunch of other things. And they've included some traditional, we would say are traditional investments, like vegetation management, which is a fancy word for tree trimming, because they make the point that unless the grid is reliable to start with, modernizing it doesn't really help if a tree is going to fall on the wires and knock them down. And then Unitil, a much, much smaller company in the Fitchburg area, has a customer base that is less well off economically, lots of unemployment still in that part of the state. So they have a more modest plan really to phase some things in, but actually they've deployed some of the technologies around metering already, so their plan looks a little bit different. So that's what's happening in Massachusetts. New York, you have New York REV, as it's called, Reforming the Energy Vision. Lots of proposals there about what role should the utilities play. Should they do everything, or are they just the platform? The DSP, the distribution system platform provider in the jargon of New York, so that everybody with cool new apps can plug into that platform. So EV charging is a great example. There's no reason the utility company needs to own electric vehicle charging, but they do need to make some investments in the distribution grid that make it easy for companies like ChargePoint and others to come in and just plug and play with their EV charging, so that you can park in a municipal parking lot and you can charge and be billed for the electricity that you're taking. I didn't even look in the parking lot here as to whether there's charges, but if you go to National Grid, any big company these days, the airport, there's places, if you have an electric vehicle, you can plug in. The state office buildings, trying to encourage this. But all of that requires some investment on the utility side of the meter, and some of investment on the part of entrepreneurs. But the cool thing about grid modernization and some of these investments is that you don't always have to use what they call ratepayers' money. The captive ratepayer is an old phrase. meaning to get electricity, unless you really go off grid, you have to connect to a utility, and then you're captive to all the charges they impose. But if in fact you want to get some investment in modernizing the grid, new technologies, there's no reason that every ratepayer needs to pay for that, because you have companies that want to come along and put in the charging stations and charge only the people that are using them. You have demand response companies that want to come along and provide demand response services and products to customers that only those customers pay for, not everybody else. But in order to get there, you need some investment in the platform, which is the distribution grid. And that's something that we're figuring out how much investment is needed and who should pay for it. Generally, it would fall to customers to pay for that. So very briefly, 3 other policy areas we pay attention to: innovation policy, support for entities like the Mass CEC. We are having some really interesting discussions in Rhode Island, who's looking at Mass CEC, and Governor Raimondo, her team is interested in how do they do something similar in Rhode Island. What are policies that we may need to support innovative and emerging companies through some hurdles that maybe we don't see? And so that's one of the things that we're committed to working with Kim and Ali Adler over the next year, and really need input from you. What are the obstacles you run into? They can be weird things like, I'm trying to do this, but zoning doesn't let me do this where I live, or there's some weird tax that applies to me. These are the kinds of things we can go to legislators and get changed. Climate policies. So this is the EPA's Clean Power Plan. It's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative here in the Northeast as a way to comply with the Clean Power Plan. But opportunities arise for entrepreneurs because there are limits on how much carbon you can emit. And so that is, and one of the reasons that many of you may get into this is because you want to have a smaller footprint on the world, and therefore regulations, policies that encourage that provide business opportunities for you. And federal has to be up here. Up until like the last couple of months, not much was happening at the federal level, but we have the Clean Power Plan. We have the Obama administration's announcement of a whole slew of new incentives for clean energy, including solar, distributed generation, demand response. It's very exciting. So those are some of the ongoing things that we pay attention to. But these 3 big bubbles have taken up a lot of our time over the last year.
Excuse me, Janice.
Yes.
Do you deal with things like the DOE 1703 loan guarantees and the pending ITC for solar?
Yes. Yeah. So we do policy work around those issues. The first 2 or 3 years I was with NECEC, 2 years, I guess, we did our DC fly-in, and I wish I could say we planned this, but it worked out with the government shutdown a couple years ago. We showed up the day after they finally got a budget, and we were really there at the right time with about 15 companies talking to key legislators, Congress people about, you need to extend the ITC and the PTC, and they did. And they were all feeling sort of euphoric. They got a budget deal, so everybody wanted to do a good thing. So it was very fortuitous timing. This time around on the ITC and the PTC, there seems to be a general view that it's not going to get extended. And companies are adjusting to that and building to that. Doesn't mean we're not taking every opportunity to talk about it, but that's sort of where that's going. But yes, things like REITs and couple of different financing options, master limited partnerships, which are some different kinds of financing that have been applied in traditional energy industries that we have sought to have, and I think succeeded in having applicable to clean energy. People differ on the value of that kind of thing, but we do. Okay. So this is the really broad overview. And then the next slide I was going to show you, and I think I see many of you have in front of you, is sort of our legislative scorecard for 2015. So if there aren't any questions sort of on broad policy stuff before I dive into the scorecard.
What about forward-looking? So for instance, you talked about demand response, but there are experiments now going on with demand response and storage. So I guess $3 million hot water heater, making hot water heaters, and storing energy. We're home in Denmark, which is the EU test bed for 100% 940,000 people is doing similar things.
Yeah.
And so when you do that, you can have thermal storage, either hot or cool. The Dutch have been doing it. So
right.
refrigerated warehousing for a long
Yep.
time. And so that's one thing that's on the horizon, and we have to make sure that policy does not cut that off. Another thing that's on the horizon is revaluing solar. So
The value of solar.
the value of solar proposition, which is coming out
Yeah.
of Besser University. And I saw a headline on an article just the other day with one study talking about solar plus storage being worth 25 cents per kilowatt hour in California, which is a very interesting proposition.
Yeah.
And the third thing is the idea of resilience and islanding microgrids.
Yeah.
And how do we do that? So how forward-looking is your policy?
So all of that is on.
Excuse me, Jay, can you repeat the
Sure.
question so that people online can
Sure. So one of the questions was how forward-looking is our policy? And are we looking at things like demand responsive storage, linking water heater storage? Are we looking at new valuations for solar? So the solar plus storage value proposition, you hear the term value of solar. And the third issue was resiliency and islanding of microgrids. So all of those issues are embedded in these three bubbles. So renewable thermal, for example, or thermal storage. I smiled when you talked about linking water heaters because I've been around long enough to remember when utilities ran direct load control water heater programs. They've actually been doing this for something like 50 years, and then they got out of this business. Where basically, you didn't used to own your water heater, the utility owned it, and they could control it, and they would turn it on and off as they needed you to reduce your load or demand on the system. So in fact, Green Mountain Power's linking of water heaters is a proposal. We have companies, is it V-Charge?
Yep.
Who has thermal storage. Think about a house. There's thermal storage that you in your water heater. It may be that you can have a renewable thermal type of heating system that uses I have a geothermal heat pump in my house in New Hampshire, uses the heat in the earth to make heat for my house, very efficient. There is biomass. There's a whole host of technologies that are in the space of renewable thermals or thermal storage that then can be coupled with something like solar. There's also the battery storage technologies, and be a way in which to capture the value, reduce your demand on the system, and reduce your cost. So that is all in the sort of emerging technologies category. It spills over some into grid mod. In terms of value of solar, that is the huge debate. Net metering is a sure thing. You know you're getting your retail rate. Everybody understands it. It's simple. There's no debate about what your electric rate is. You open your bill every month and you can see what it is. One of the recommendations out of the Net Metering Task Force is for the next generation of solar incentives. Solar should pay for use of the distribution system. That's the big issue. They don't do that when there's net metering because, in fact, they don't have to, they get a credit against their distribution bill. And then they should get paid. They should be compensated for the value they provide to that system. Some of it's to the distribution system, some of it's to the transmission system, some of it relates to avoided generation, some of it relates to avoided greenhouse gas emissions, jobs. There's a whole host of things you can put in the value column and add that up and say, this is what the value of solar is. Maine's value of solar study showed about 30 cents, 34 cents, I can't remember exactly the number, on a 25-year levelized basis is the value of solar. You see numbers coming out of California for a combination of solar and storage. So that's what you could pay to solar, to customers, people who install solar, to say, you're providing a value to the system, we're going to pay you this instead of doing net metering. I think that the debate centers on what is that value, over what time frame are you measuring it. Those who are confident that it's a big number are gung-ho for a value of solar approach. Those who are less confident that it's a big number are less gung-ho about a value of solar approach. So yes, clearly front and center in the solar debate. Resiliency, microgrids, huge, huge issue. In the last few years, we've seen Hurricane Sandy and the other big unnamed storm, devastation in the Northeast that we haven't seen in a long, long time, and really brought home to Connecticut, New York in particular, the value of resiliency and microgrids. You saw people parked in library parking lots using their power. If you live on the circuit that has the police station, the fire station, or the hospital, your power will be restored first. So when you're looking for a house, look around and see who else is your neighbors. We're talking to Representative Golden, House Chair of the Energy Committee, who was commenting that his street was always restored first. And then he was talking about where he was, and I said, you're on the same circuit as the sewage treatment plant. They get that back up first. There's certain things that happen. And so the ability to island, as we saw in New York City, hospitals, universities, some who did not have their backup generators in the basement, another thing we learned, but had them on a higher floor, were able to island and keep power going. So there's tremendous interest. Goldman Sachs, okay. Think about where it is absolutely essential to keep power flowing. And the ways in which companies do that. So companies make investments. Companies that need to keep the power on, they have backup generation. They pay for second contingency circuits. So there's a whole new way of looking at this, and new technologies emerging that will provide this resiliency in a cheaper, more modular way. And then a whole new level of interest on the part of utilities in the system. How can they tap that? A whole bunch of customers have invested in these things already. When they island, they benefit themselves, but nobody else. Is there a way to run them in parallel? Is there a way to configure the system to make use of them? So again, front and center in the grid mod or 21st century. That's too many words. To me, I say grid mod, the grid mod discussion.
One last thing is district heating, district cooling, which is very, 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 very big in the EU.
Yeah.
But very, very, very small in the United States now, although it used to be big here in the United States.
So that's an interesting one where policies suddenly matter a lot.
Yeah.
So here in Boston, we have district heating. We have the Kendall Station on the Cambridge side, which brings steam over to the Boston side, and then there's the Neyland Street Station in Boston that's going to need to be refurbished. And this is owned by a company called Trigen. I forget who it was before that, but they've had district heating for a long time. A few years ago, there was a lot of discussion about encouraging combined heat and power. Hospitals have put in their own generation. But somewhere in the middle of that discussion, we suddenly realized, and this is an ongoing discussion, we're replacing district heat, which is a really efficient and clean way to get heat, with with a bunch of companies putting in their own CHP, combined heat and power units, which is a little generator that makes heat, but it also makes power. And say, wait, does this really make sense for the carbon footprint? Maybe, while hospitals are generally great CHP loads, if there's someplace where there's district heat, they're even better district heat users. So this is why policy matters, and you can't think of things in isolation, and you want to put all these pieces together. So I think some of the New York Rev discussions have been driven initially by resiliency, but then about greenhouse gases is how can you deploy CHP? Where can you revitalize district heat in the US? Where does it make sense to maybe build something from scratch if you're doing a lot of new building and development? So let me turn to our scorecard, which I can't see. But so what we do every year is we're involved through state partner organizations in all of the New England states. And in New York, we're involved on the regulatory side with New York Rev, but not really on the legislative side. So we'll be rolling this out tomorrow. We may tweak it a little bit more. But these are pieces of legislation or proceedings we followed in each of the New England states. And I'll just not go into all the details here. There's a ton of words. But what you'll see is a theme. So across all of the states, there's been activity on the solar front. So if you look at Connecticut, the second box down and the fourth box down, they had a pilot community shared solar. We said, you don't need a pilot, just go all out. Nah, the utilities weren't too sure about that. So they have a pilot, 2 projects over 3 years, better than nothing, can test a few things. And the governor came up with his SHREC program, the Solar Home Renewable Energy Credit, when he gets the prize for the best acronym to do incentives for residential solar. In Maine, you saw an attempt to do a solar carve-out bill that actually has ended up in this yellow box here to be a study about an incentive program that's an alternative to net metering. But there was, so that's their solar bill. Massachusetts, in this top box here, you see the Senate bill that amendment that is the one I mentioned before, Senator Downing. The governor's solar bill was out there. We had the net metering task force. New Hampshire on the solar front, they have done some net metering legislative fixes. If it's yellow, the outcome was sort of uncertain. Either it isn't resolved or it wasn't a bad outcome, but we didn't win it either. Green is a win, and right now we don't have any reds, but some reds may show up before the end of the year. The only legislature still in session is Massachusetts. While a couple things can happen in a couple other states, it would be unlikely. But you can see solar in Rhode Island comes through the implementation of the Renewable Energy Growth Program, which is a result of legislation we got passed in 2014. And Vermont has actually implemented an RPS. So solar's theme is throughout there. Energy efficiency. This has been a big year for energy efficiency. It's been really interesting. New Hampshire has long lagged the region in energy efficiency, but the stars have aligned. And I lived in New Hampshire for 14 years and worked on this, so I have a very happy that this has happened. The stars have aligned. The PUC is doing an energy efficiency procurement standard or resource standard proceeding. Is it going to be like the most ambitious? No, but it's way more than it was doing, and lots of business opportunities. A lot of folks in many of our companies we've urged to get involved, and they have gotten involved. In Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Maine, Massachusetts and Maine right now, they're in the point in the cycle where they're doing their 3-year energy efficiency plans. Maine, key piece of legislation in Maine was to restore $38 million of funding to Efficiency Maine Trust that was cut by an inadvertent omission of the word "and" in a sentence. So the budget went from $60 million to $22 million, and needed a piece of legislation to get that done. You'd think that would be easy, but the politics in Maine are interesting, to say the least, if anybody's familiar, but we got it done. All of these, as they're doing these efficiency programs now, the policymakers are saying, Mass has been #1 in energy efficiency for 4 years. Most of our states are in the top 10, and I think like half of them at least, or 4 of the 6 are in the top 5. So how do you do it better? How do you do it differently? We're spending $500 million a year on energy efficiency in Massachusetts already. There is a budget constraint. How much more can we spend? So there's been real interest in behavioral energy efficiency, and many of our members have gotten involved, and we've pushed this, and they've been adopted, and they've been taken up by the entities that work out the energy efficiency plans to say, let's focus on behavioral efficiency. How do we get some more demand response in here? How do we get a bigger bang for our buck? How do you provide some options, say, for the small commercial industrial sector that doesn't quite fit into the mass market residential type programs, but they're not big enough to get their own account managers with utilities, their own programs? How do you come up with some innovative ways to deliver energy efficiency services, maybe by third parties for that sector? So that's all been the discussion. Also been a huge discussion in New York, because as you make the transition from where New York is today to the reformed energy vision of the New York future, what happens to energy efficiency programs that were run by NYSERDA, that were run by the utilities? So NYSERDA is not going to be in the business of running programs anymore. Those goals have been handed off to the utilities, but not the budgets to achieve those goals. You know, it's always the miracle of making something out of nothing. And so I think part of what we've been doing in New York is reminding policymakers that outside of fairy tales, that's really hard and maybe not possible, so that they need to make sure the transition doesn't mean that New York goes backwards in terms of energy efficiency instead of continuing to advance.
You got Senate Bill 1965 here, and the larger discussion of pipelines and transmission lines. And I'm sorry, I came in a bit late. I don't know if you touched on this earlier, but can you tell us a bit about NECEC's positions in regards to layering in transmission costs in the billions?
So the question was about Massachusetts Senate Bill 1965, which is about long-term contracts for clean energy resources and related transmission. This is the governor's bill. Yeah, I think he got 1965 is his number. So the governor put out a bill. He characterized it as a hydro bill, but the question was, where does NEC stand on this? What I said before you came in is that this is the one bubble I wasn't going to talk about. It's actually our 4th bubble, because I wasn't sure it was of broad interest to this group. But in fact, our position is that we want to leverage the policy interest in hydro infrastructure to make sure that there is a minimum percentage of Class 1 renewables, in-region renewables, included as part of any of those contracts. So onshore wind, I was talking to somebody earlier who actually does some financing work on the big development side. the cheapest way to get onshore large grid scale renewables is with long-term contracts, because they need to be financed, and the cheapest financing comes with some surety about the revenue stream that the developer will get. Long-term contracts give you that surety, it lowers the cost of financing, you can ensure that the projects get built. Wind is an intermittent resource. I'm sure that's a huge surprise to all of you. And wind is generally in the north and load is in the south, in New England, in the Northeast, in New York, the same case. I think it's some like universal geographic thing. I haven't really explored whether south of the equator it goes the other way. But what it means is you need transmission to get the wind resources in northern New England to southern New England. You need transmission to get wind in upstate New York to downstate New York. And I worked for several years at National Grid trying to get that built, and it's almost impossible. I think they've had some success since I left. One of the ways to get transmission built is making it cheaper. You can make it cheaper by firming the wind with hydro. So if you say, I have a contract for X, 600 megawatts of wind on this transmission line, and when the wind isn't blowing, I'm actually going to be flowing hydroelectricity on that line. That reduces the per kilowatt hour cost of the transmission line and can make it feasible. Lots of debate you hear about Northern Pass transmission that Eversource wants to build from Canada down to Massachusetts through New Hampshire. At the other end of that, they've talked about bringing in Hydro-Quebec hydropower. But again, it's all about how do you pay for the transmission by having it connected to some cheap, clean resource on the other side. We don't take positions on individual transmission projects. We have a number of members who have their own transmission for renewable projects. What we try to do is advance policy that's going to give them a business opportunity to build their transmission as long as it's bringing in class 1 renewables, to the southern states. To all of the states, but generally the need is in the southern states and the renewables are in the north. What other themes are here? You see themes around financing for energy efficiency. So you have PACE programs, property assessed clean energy, other ways to finance investments in efficiency and renewables that don't involve using ratepayer money, system benefit charges on your electricity charges. Rhode Island, in its budget, has created a Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, the RRIB, that's going to have, present new opportunities for financing, particularly for municipalities, for other public entities who can use their bonding authority in a different way to actually pay for energy efficiency improvements, renewable investments, solar on landfills, things like that. I'm going to stop there, I think. It's like a little after 1, and answer questions. I think the last slide is really how to reach our policy and government affairs team. So I'm the VP of Policy and Government Affairs. Peter Rothstein, whom some of you may know because he is our president, so he's on the innovation side, the policy side. Again, a key player. Sue Anderbaugh is our policy analyst, and she doubles as our Rhode Island state coordinator. And Dan Bosley is our government relations executive, our lobbyist, really important. I view lobbying in the sense of the Federalist Papers. We inform legislators and we provide them with the resources they need to make good policy choices. And anyone with a traditional education will know what the Federalist Papers are. Or if you're over 40.
A lot of engineers.
Okay. But in any case, and Dan oversees sort of our advocacy work in all of the states. So I hope that's been helpful to you, gives you some sense of where you might fit into this policy framework as you're starting to take your businesses forward and your ideas forward. And really, if you even suspect an intersection or you're worried about an intersection, one of the things that we're trying to do is to set up a process whereby you can raise that to our attention. We've got it on our radar screen. We're out there talking to policymakers all the time. Policymakers love clean tech. They love advanced technology. They love supporting innovation. So they look for these opportunities. They generally mean that some money has to be spent, but this is a really feel-good thing for legislators and policymakers. And so we want to be able to bring them examples of businesses, emerging businesses they should be supporting and how they can do it in a way that's really efficient and is going to clearly demonstrate benefits for constituents. That makes their day. So I'll stop talking and let you all ask questions. And I think people remote can ask questions through Kim somehow.
Right. Or if Sarah wants to ping me, I can unmute them and they can actually ask them
Okay.
directly.
John?
Janet, thank you very much. Would you mind if I ask you to crystal ball a little bit?
No. That's
Back to
okay.
the
See,
scorecard.
John is cheating, though. So John is asking if I would do some crystal ball. Go ahead, ask your question.
If you go to the first box under Massachusetts, what are a couple scenarios for how the tension between those two bills and other interests might unfold over the coming months?
So tomorrow on Radio Boston at, I think, 3 o'clock, I will be on Radio Boston with Amy Rabinowitz from National Grid and Jürgen Weiss from the Brattle Group talking about solar policy and net metering policy. So that's my little advertisement for that. You know, the debate is around, do you lift the cap now and then figure out what the long-term framework is, or do you have to figure out the long-term framework ahead of time? So the governor's bill says he'll lift the cap to 1,600 megawatts. He'll give the DPU the discretion to decide if it needs to be lifted after that. And the long-term framework is that instead of getting paid the retail rate for any excess production, you get the wholesale rate. And that's a difference of really very roughly 20 cents and 10 cents a kilowatt hour for stuff that you generate that's more than you're using at that point in time. The Senator Downing's bill, and the one that we've been very supportive of, lifts the cap now and says the DPU should do a process and the DOER should do a value of solar analysis. And that process would say, based on the value of solar results from the DOER, the Department of Energy Resources, that would be input to a proceeding at the Department of Public Utilities, which is the agency that sets electricity rates, and lets them say, okay, here's what people should pay for using the distribution system, and here's what solar should be compensated. And that would be a process that would play out over the next year or so. The governor recently said at a meeting with the Eastern Canadian premiers and the other New England governors that he wants to move his solar bill and he wants to move his clean energy resources bill, and he wants to do it this fall. I think if there's a will on the part of the administration to get something done this fall, the clean energy community has been advocating for months that we need to do something as soon as possible. I think there's an opportunity to get a bill done this fall that will meet the needs of the solar community, and it'll involve some compromise. But so I have to remain optimistic, or we'll leave it at that. But I think there is an opportunity this fall. Any questions?
I think in 2012, January 2012, at the beginning of the last session, there was an environmental breakfast. And a whole variety of environmental groups got together. And they said, this year, this session, what we want to do is we want to focus on transportation. Right? And it's very unusual in my experience for environmental groups to get together and then to focus on one thing.
Yeah.
They were not successful.
Right.
What is your relationship to the other environmental groups, and how close are they to actually getting together to do something? They tried something with transportation, it didn't work. Are they going to try something else? Are they going to come together as a real coalition?
Sure. So the question is, how close is NECEC to environmental groups and other coalitions and other entities out there? So we work very closely with the environmental advocates and with the other clean energy business groups. So we are a business group, which are distinction from the environmental advocates. But the example you gave about a 2012 breakfast of the environmental groups focused on transportation that didn't pan out. In 2012, NECEC led a coalition along with the Conservation Law Foundation to get a comprehensive energy bill in Massachusetts that did turn out really, really well. We started out in a defensive posture, but we really ended up with extending and expanding long-term contracts, expanding net metering, expanding what's called virtual or remote net metering, but a lot of good things in that energy bill that we got by working together. So when I talk about NECEC advocating for policy, we don't do this by ourselves. We're way too small. We wouldn't get anywhere. We do this by building coalitions with other entities. So on the solar issues, we've been working closely with a solar coalition that involves SEIA, the Solar Energy Industries Association, CBANE, Mass Solar, and Vote Solar. And then among our membership, there's a host of other folks that are involved in this. We work with Acadia Center, which is the former ENE, Environment Northeast, Conservation Law Foundation, specifically on the rate design issues we're talking about. There is a group called Power Forward that is an environmental group. I think it's being led by ELM, the Environmental League of Mass, and somebody else, and I'm blanking on who that is. That has got a very environmental focus. So we will work with them. We will partner with them. We will join them when we share visions. But we also distinguish ourselves for a couple reasons. One, sometimes what business needs is not what the pure environmentalist needs. So we're focused on what businesses need to succeed. And that we found in the recent years that making that business case to policymakers has been more effective than making the pure environmental case. And so one, sometimes the needs are different, but the other part of focusing on the business side is that it resonates. We talk a lot about jobs, dollars of investment in the state, megawatts of resources deployed. So we're very focused on that economic side, we lead by saying, clean energy has economic, energy, and environmental benefits, and we talk about it in that order because that resonates with the folks we're trying to influence.
There's one other piece of legislation which is overarching and on your scorecard, which is the revenue carbon tax proposal.
So the revenue neutral carbon, so this is Janet's opinion. A revenue neutral carbon tax is the right policy, period, hands down. It is unlikely to get implemented. And so for us, we do some triaging of what makes it to our priority list. And so a revenue neutral carbon tax is down here in our climate bubble. If that were to move or had legs under it, we would be out there. We support it, but in terms of the energy we expend on it, it's not a lot because it's not going to make opportunities for clean energy businesses in the Northeast in the reasonable near term. As a commissioner, I tried to get the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners to endorse a carbon tax, which they did not. But, coming from an economics background, bottom line, it's the right thing to do. Gasoline costs $4 a gallon. Guess what? People bought smaller cars. Look what's happening today. Under $2, what are people buying? SUVs.
So even with the success in British Columbia, with their revenue carbon tax, people are not.
There's bills in Massachusetts or bills in Vermont. There's a whole notion that you can do this state by state.
And there's a referendum coming out of Washington.
State of Washington, yeah. The question is, what does it mean to have this, do this state by state? We really need this at the federal level, and maybe we'll get there.
You do actively lobby for RGGI, correct?
We do actively lobby for RGGI, and we actually are very active in saying RGGI should be a compliance mechanism for the Clean Power Plan, bring more states into RGGI, because it's a very cost-effective way that provides opportunities for clean energy businesses. Because if it's all command and control, you have to put this emissions control on your power plant. There's no opportunity for a clean energy business. But in RGGI, which we're not supposed to say cap and trade anymore, but a market-based system like RGGI means that, in fact, there are dollars that can flow to the clean energy community. RGGI dollars flow to fund energy efficiency programs throughout New England. So, did you have a question?
You actually kind of answered it. My question was going to be, so the Clean Power Plan, how much is that expected to disrupt what's going on your scorecard? How much is what's going on your scorecard just going to become the state implementation plans under the Clean Power Plan? How much are they just going to run parallel and pretend that each doesn't exist?
They won't run parallel. What they'll do is the climate bubble will get bigger. A lot of the drivers for solar, the primary driver for the clean energy resources bill are compliance with greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets or requirements. So the Global Warming Solutions Act in Massachusetts and Connecticut, they're real drivers for policy here. A lot of those state laws mean that we're ahead of the game nationally in terms of compliance with the Clean Power Plan. But actually what I would see is this bubble getting bigger and sort of showing up over here, intersecting, as we are looking to say one of the other reasons to do solar policy is you're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help with compliance with the Clean Power Plan. Another reason to enable onshore wind, offshore wind, and hydro to support it is because you need to comply with the Clean Power Plan. Any other questions?
The follow-on question is, you talked about energy efficiency programs, and then you historically have difficulty reaching out to like low income users of energy. Clean Power Plan says we'll give you double the credits.
Yeah.
Is that are there people that are sitting there saying, I have this great idea for low income residents, but the money isn't there? Is that going to be good enough?
So here's what we're trying to do. So the way energy efficiency gets done in most of the New England states is there are these 3-year plans, or there's annual plans that the utilities or the program administrators, because in some places, like the Cape Light Compact, put these plans together. And they go through the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council in Mass, the Energy Efficiency and Resource Management Council in Rhode Island, the EASY board, and I don't even remember what that stands for in New Hampshire, but there's a boards with all these people that care about energy efficiency that review the plans. And so what we've been trying to do along those lines is to say, hey, look at behavioral programs. So with double credits for low income programs, if somebody's got a great idea about how to reach the low income market, we're going to help them. So we have member companies. They bring the ideas to us. It's not like there's only like 3 of us, or you saw the team, there's 4 of us. We don't think it all up ourselves. Our companies come to us and say, this is really important. And so then we package it, bring it forward. They write stuff, we tweak it, and we put it in. And because what we can lend then is the imprimatur, if you will, of a large business association saying this is good for clean energy, it can be more persuasive. So yes, I would expect lots of opportunities. So on the solar front, what started out is some companies doing low-income solar by doing putting the solar over here and the credits to a bunch of people in low-income housing has morphed into virtual net metering community. It's really morphed into community shared solar. That was the basis for that. So yes, that will definitely get, swept up there. Emily.
I want to say thank you. This has been very informative. My head is already sitting.
Yeah.
I didn't really know about it. My question is, I get asked a lot, is the policies that we have, are the policies we have in place right now effective? And in particular on red, how has that been successful? And how would you answer that question? What metrics do you say red is?
Sure. So the question is, have our policies, clean energy policies, been successful? In particular, has red been successful? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. So I was here, actually the last time, for somebody from EPA was here, and Dave Cash was here with this big chart of the economy line going up. And Dave Cash, for those who don't know, is the former DEP commissioner, Department of Environmental Protection, and before that he was a DPU commissioner, and then in the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. So he showed economic growth going up, and greenhouse gas emissions plunging, going down. So RGGI sets a cap on emissions, and so if you have a power plant and you need to buy allowances to emit pollution because you're burning oil or gas or coal and you have to have those, then that money goes for the allowances, and some of the money that you pay for allowances goes to fund energy efficiency programs. So that's been very successful. With the decline in the cost of natural gas and the construction of natural gas-fired power plants, we saw a huge drop in emissions in New England because we converted from oil and coal rather to natural gas. So that was a huge help. But again, driven by RGGI and some of the dynamics around RGGI. The price for carbon that RGGI puts on a ton of carbon is like $4, $5. It's really small compared to estimates you see out of Europe and the UK, but it's something, and it starts to move a market. And because of the way the states have used the RGGI funds to do energy efficiency, which leverages even more benefits, they've magnified the effectiveness.
According to a recent study by the International Energy Agency, the average price for a ton of CO2 is $7.
Yeah. It's interesting because when I was at National Grid, they actually did an exercise where they internally priced carbon at $50 a ton to say, okay, what business decisions that we make would we change if we put a $50 a ton cost? So if we're deciding to use, what the heck are they called? It's a thing that you have at a substation that insulates it, and some use really bad gases to do the insulation. It's like SF6 or 12 or something like that. SF6. PCBs they're long gone. They're not allowed anymore. No. But SF6. So they can make a decision about buying a transformer. Is it a transformer with SF6 or some better, less horrible greenhouse gas. And so they did the analysis, even things like their fleets. If we're pricing carbon at $50 a ton, is it worth buying the more efficient, the better truck, or a whole fleet of better trucks? And it's a challenge for a business to do that, and they're not the only ones. Many businesses go through this exercise, and some actually implement or invest based on that. But clearly, yeah, right. And sometimes they do it because they're making 20, 30, 40, 50-year investments, and they know this regulation is going to be coming down the pike if it's not here today. Any other questions? Well, I hope this has been interesting. Please think about this as a resource. Disconnected.